most young Americans, born into a land exultant with hope and with golden promise, toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place? The answer, like the war itself, is not an easy one, but it echoes clearly from the painful lessons of half a century. 3 times in my lifetime, in 2 world wars and in Korea, Americans have gone to far lands to fight for freedom. We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam.
During the Vietnam era, there were times when it wasn't really pleasant to be in uniform.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. For the most part orderly, minor scuffles did occur between the demonstrators and hecklers.
Sometimes we weren't treated very nicely.
A 3-hour parade takes the demonstrators across the Potomac on their way to the Pentagon. The crowd, estimated at about 50,000 persons, was a loose confederation of some 150 groups and included adults, students, even children.
That sort of had a negative impact, you know, but. I grew up here in Rockford. I graduated from East High in 1964. Well, it was my mom and dad and 2 brothers, one older, one younger, and back in the 50s, things were a little simpler than they are now. But I went to Kishwaukee School, which is obviously on Kishwaukee Street, and I wasn't a real good student. I was just sort of average, so, But the city was smaller, and we would go downtown to do a lot of social activities and go to the movies. There was, the Coronado and some other theaters downtown, and a lot of the shopping was down there, the department stores. Well, the Vietnam War was getting going pretty, ominously in 1963 or thereabouts, and a lot of my friends were joining the Navy. Well, actually, it was the Navy Reserve, and so when I graduated from high school, I just decided that was the time to enlist. So.
We do not want an expanding struggle with consequences that no one can foresee, nor will we bluster or bully or flaunt our power. But we will not surrender, and we will not retreat. I do not find it easy to send the flower of our youth, our finest young men, into battle. I have seen them in 1,000 streets of 100 towns in every state in this union, working and laughing and building and filled with hope and life. But as long as there are men who hate and destroy, we must have the courage to resist. We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else. Nor would surrender in Vietnam bring peace, because we learned from Hitler at Munich that success only feeds the appetite of aggression. Moreover, we were in Vietnam to fulfill one of the most solemn pledges of the American nation. 3 presidents, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and your present president, over 11 years have committed themselves and have promised to help defend this small and valiant nation. Strengthened by that promise, the people of South Vietnam have fought for many long years. Thousands of them have died. Thousands more have been crippled and scarred by war. And we just cannot now dishonor our word or abandon our commitment or leave those who believed us and who trusted us to the terror and repression and murder that would follow.
I just had the feeling that I needed to do something. I didn't want to wait for the draft. So when I graduated from high school, I just decided that was the time to enlist. I really didn't care so much if, you know, I mean, it was in the back of my mind. It wouldn't have bothered me if they sent me over there. I just had reservations about, you know, having to be sent out in the jungle. I had no experience with that sort of life, and as I said, several friends were going in the Navy. I thought that would be a really neat experience, so that's why I decided to do that. But yeah, I wouldn't have minded going to Vietnam. Well, the training was in 2 different locations. I was in a Navy Reserve, so we had a training center on 15th Avenue in Rockford, down by the Marinelli Field. It's still there. If you drive by, it was the building is kind of arched in the middle, and that was the Naval Reserve Training Center. And so I had a lot of my training there, and then I went to basic training at Great Lakes, you know, north of Chicago. And I had, being reserved, then we had to do 2 years of summertime training. So I went back to Great Lakes for another training session in 1965, I think, in the summertime. That's when I actually got aboard a ship, and we went out in Lake Michigan and did some training. It was the kind of situation where you didn't ever disobey what anybody told you. I mean, a lot of times they get right in face to face and yell at you about what you're supposed to be doing. It really kind of kept you on your toes all the time. I was exposed to tear gas when I was at basic training, and that was something that reminded me that I'd never want to do that again. If there was any situation where the police or somebody was throwing tear gas, I wanted to make sure I kept completely away from that. Well, my enlistment said that I was going to serve 2 years of what they call active reserve. That was the training part, and then 2 years of active duty, and then the final 2 years of my 6-year obligation was to have standby reserve, you know. And so the 2 years of active duty, I was sent in January of 1966. I got orders to go to Norfolk, Virginia, where there's a big U.S. Navy base. And when I got there, I waited for a week in the transition, and then I was assigned to the USS Austin. That's the hat I'm wearing now. And it was a brand new ship, so I was kind of fortunate in that respect. But I was originally thought I was going to get a specialized training, and when I went on active duty, I was ordered to report the school that I was supposed to go to wasn't available. So I spent the first 6 months aboard ship doing what they call the deck force. That involved a lot of painting and washing the decks and just menial tasks. But every day we got what was called the plan of the day. It would tell you, what the schedule for the day was and what clothing was appropriate for each day, and what sort of things we were doing. And we had an officer that was in charge of designing that plan of the day all the time. And this one person, his favorite expression was to stamp out levity. In other words, he didn't want people laughing and carrying on and having a good time. You were supposed to be concentrating on your business throughout the day. But sometimes you'd have to stand a watch somewhere on the ship. And then, so we had reveille in the morning that they would make a musical sort of announcement that would get us up. So typical day, you had probably 8 hours to do your normal job, whatever that was. And then, you had your meal time and a little bit of time for just relaxing. And so that was a typical day. One thing that bothered me the most was we had demonstrations of jet aircraft flying at the ship and going past. They flew so fast, it was hard to see them coming, and that was kind of really frightening. Well, you have to request changing from one part of the ship's duties to another, and so I made the request and it was approved, and so I transitioned into a different area. Besides handling the mail every day, sorting it and distributing it, and selling stamps and other supplies for people, I had military duties, which were I was when we were out at sea, I was in the Combat Information Center where the radar is and the communications, So if there's like if airplanes coming close or other ships, we keep track of all that. And then I stood watches on the bridge where the power is and the navigation and all those things. And when we were in port, then I did watches on the quarterdeck where at first I was a messenger, and then I had to record events that happened, people that came and went, and I was the petty officer of the watch. I was armed with a .45 caliber pistol. Most of the time we just watched for other ships and the cargo ships and other activities. Because there was a Cold War, there were times when the Russian ships were following us. They had what they call the trawlers, but they were basically spying. And so at certain times we were restricted about what we could throw over the back of the ship, the waste materials and things. If there was printed matter on those, then we had to be careful about what we put over the end, But we were trained, we had cannons on the ship. I was trained how to help use those in the beginning, and then later on, as I say, I was doing radar and other things. But since it was an amphibious ship, we did practice landings, and sometimes with the boats going to the landing spot, we would communicate with them on the ship's radio, and that was part of my responsibility.
Following the death of General Rafael Trujillo in 1961, the Dominican Republic became unstable. Juan Bosch Gavino won the 1963 election in a landslide, but later he was overthrown by the Dominican military. This prompted many riots in an effort to restore Gavino's presidency. Donald Reed Cabral became the new president but lacked the support of Juan Bosch and his supporters, later resulting in a coup and officially starting the Civil War on April 24, 1965. The first blitz of the Dominican Civil War by Francisco Alberto Camino Deno, known as the Camino Revolt, occurred in response to this. In fear of communism spreading to the Dominican Republic, President Lyndon B. Johnson launched a U.S. intervention on April 28, 1965, known today as Operation Powerpack.
The American nation cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere.
U.S. troops had gone in there to try to stabilize the situation. At that time during the Cold War, people were afraid that the Caribbean and other places would become communists, so the U.S. troops went in to stabilize it, and part of the intent was to keep them from becoming a communist nation. The troops that were involved in the Dominican Republic were actually Cuban troops, and so the ground forces went in to try to contain that situation.
President Johnson ordered the troop movement when it appeared doubtful that a stable government could be established immediately. The rebels claimed rule of the country, but their regime collapsed when neutral naval and army units joined government forces led by General Wesson. He was the leader of the rebellion in 1963 that ousted President Bosch on charges that he was pro-Castro.
We carried troops, either Army or Marines, and all their equipment, all the tanks and the trucks and all that sort of thing. And so we helped either deliver it to where they needed to go or to remove it and take them back to their base in the United States. And I think it was the 82nd Airborne that we were taking out, so it was probably 2,000 troops and their equipment.
Also during June, the 320th Artillery, 82nd Airborne Division is going home after 7 months as a part of the Inter-American Police Force. Before dawn, a convoy moves out of Camp Coleman near Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Then a short period of waiting at the ocean's edge. On schedule, an LST, the Waldo County, starts to take on this contingent of the 320th for return to Sunny Point, North Carolina. Other elements of the unit are returning by air.
On September 3, 1965, the Civil War finally ended and the U.S. troops returned to North Carolina.
we found out that the Russians were following us, and yeah, that was probably one of the only things I was really frightened of, is something happening because of the Russians following us. Nothing ever did. Being out at sea at night, if you go out on the weather decks at night, and like in the Caribbean, for example, the stars were just amazing. Just, you can't see stars like you can here. It's just incredible how they light up the sky. You know, it's like a big umbrella over you. We encountered civilians, especially in Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands or Panama, and we were always amazed how the little kids in these communities, especially like in Puerto Rico, San Juan, how they could pick out that we were GIs, you know. And so we put the civilian clothes on, but we didn't have different shoes, and we would wear our military shoes. And shortly afterwards, we discovered that the civilian kids figured out we were military personnel by our shoes. They were right on us as soon as we walked on shore. They wanted to give us shoe shines and that sort of thing. But for the most part, most everybody was not hostile to us. I had a fair amount of leisure time, mostly just spent it when we went to shore leave. Then we would go swimming or other activities of that sort, but otherwise I spent time in the library or other places on the ship, you know, for recreation. During the Vietnam era, there were times when it wasn't really pleasant to be in uniform. If you were walking down the street, there was one occasion when people were throwing things as they passed by us on a bus. They were throwing things at us, and in the downtown area of Norfolk, there was signs on people's grass that said "Sailors and dogs keep off the grass." That sort of had a negative impact, you know, but now as time has gone by, it's not as much of an issue as it was back then. I'd say I matured a lot with, you know, having to meet the expectations of what my duties were, and to be prepared to do what was needed at any time without being elective about how I was going to behave and what I was going to do. Is you react really pretty instantly when something happens or you get an order, and that was probably the biggest change I had to go through. But I'm still bothered by it. Loud noises, you know, unexpected. I react if I hear gunshots or firecrackers or whatever.
I first became interested in the Harlem Veteran Project my freshman year when my sister was a part of this class. I attended the annual gala where I heard many stories from all different kinds of vets. At the beginning of this school year, I picked my veteran off a long list of veterans. The only thing I knew about Carl was that he was in the Navy Reserves and was a part of Operation Powerpack. I then began to watch his interview, and I became attached to his story. He taught me so many things that I will always be thankful for. I learned that although he was not in the Vietnam War, he received the same treatment as those vets. This class will forever have an everlasting impact on me, and I am not the same person I was when I first started this class. The stories you told will always stay with me, and the lessons that you taught me I will remember forever. Thank you, Carl, for being so selfless and being able to do something that I never could. You're a true hero.